There was a mini controversy during last month's playoffs that caught my eye. It was a Twitter controversy, and a pretty low stakes one, even for that site, but it started when an account posted a video of Juan Soto's home run in Game 5 of the ALCS, but with the music from the Moneyball movie edited in.
Got a steal. Soto, a high fly ball to center. Thomas backing up. Thomas at the track. And Juan Soto! A three-run home run!
This made people mad because it seemed to totally miss the point of the movie. The team that gave up the home run, the Cleveland Guardians, was precisely the kind of low-payroll success story celebrated in Moneyball, whereas Soto hit the home run for the dreaded Yankees, the big-market villains of that story. And of course, Soto himself is about to be a free agent, likely to sign a contract bigger than some teams' whole payrolls. It was a reminder that, for many people, the story of Moneyball is primarily still the story of small-market teams versus big-market teams. And that makes sense. After all, that is how Michael Lewis explicitly framed the story in his book. But this controversy gets at why I felt like this video series was necessary, because that's simply not the right way to remember Moneyball. After all, as I've said over and over in this series, the statistical revolution that Billy Beane helped usher into his front office was not confined to small market teams. And more to the point, the key to Oakland's success in that period was not really the innovative statistical approach that Billy Beane employed. So as I wrap this series up, I want to conclude today by highlighting some things that Moneyball got right, but also some things it got very wrong, before presenting what I think is the real legacy of Moneyball.
How can you not be romantic about baseball?
It's a metaphor.
I know it's a metaphor.
The first thing it got right was the stats. The advanced analytics were usually better at evaluating players than the old-fashioned stats. That doesn't mean old school statistics were bad necessarily, and we shouldn't ignore things like batting average, RBIs, pitcher wins. Those stats are part of the story of baseball. But recognizing the limitations of those stats and encouraging fans to be open-minded about new ways to evaluate players was definitely good for the game. But we should say that one thing Moneyball got wrong was the implication that these stats were confined to Oakland or Billy Beane or small market teams in general. In fact, sabermetrics had been slowly gaining acceptance in front offices around the league, from New York to Toronto to Cleveland. And while Michael Lewis did sometimes acknowledge this in the book, he kind of overstates the degree to which Oakland's front office is an outlier, in an attempt to make Billy Beane seem like more of a trailblazer than he really was. Of course, that Oakland A's team was an outlier, just in terms of how good it was. That's something else the book got right. Those A's teams were really good. I think in some ways that gets forgotten now, because they never made it out of the division series, and the movie especially kind of portrays them as scrappy underdogs. But the Oakland Athletics were dominant in that period, winning at least 96 games for 3 years in a row, something only 2 other AL teams have done since then. The Astros dynasty in the late 2010s and the Yankee teams that were contemporaneous with the Oakland and sort of their nemesis in that period. The thing is, Moneyball is very wrong about why those A's were so good. It's a little weird, honestly, and it's one of the book's biggest flaws. Michael Lewis frames the subject of his book very explicitly. In the book's preface, he says that he wants to grapple with the question of how Oakland can build a sustainable winner on a low budget. He writes, quote, "There was no question Billy was the best in the game. The question was why," end quote. And he comes back to this question over and over and over again throughout the book. How are the A's able to stay so good on such a low budget? And yet the book is very wrong about the answer it gives and even the formulation of the question. First of all, there's no great mystery as to why the A's were competitive on a low budget in this period. It's the same way that every low payroll team is able to be competitive, by having a lot of great players who have not yet reached free agency. All the best players on those Athletics teams, Jason Giambi, Miguel Tejada, Eric Chavez, Mark Mulder, Tim Hudson, Barry Zito, were all under team control, meaning Oakland did not have to pay them a fair market salary. It wasn't some brilliant innovation by Billy Beane that got him those guys. It was just a feature of the collective bargaining agreement that allows teams to underpay young players. But as I said, it's not just that Michael Lewis glosses over this answer, it's that his very framing of the question is wrong. The weirdest thing about reading Moneyball in 2024 is that Lewis keeps insisting that the Oakland A's are a consistently competitive team and not an aberration or a fluke thanks to their brilliant front office. Of course, almost immediately after the book came out, the A's would become a picture of mediocrity, missing the playoffs in 7 of the next 8 seasons and winning just 5 total playoff games in the next 2 decades. In fact, their success in the Moneyball era was an aberration, and once those young stars I mentioned reached free agency or were traded away, the team stopped being good. To be clear, this is not a criticism of Billy Beane, who was dealing with a particularly extreme budget situation thanks to a particularly terrible string of owners. And Moneyball was right that given the constraints he was dealing with, Billy Beane was a very good general manager. It's just that no GM is as important as the players, and you have to pay players if you want to be consistently good. Not only was Billy Beane good at his job, he was an interesting guy. That's another thing the book got right. The conflict that Michael Lewis highlights in Moneyball between baseball traditionalists and new stat heads was real, and Beane was a pivotal and interesting figure in that fight. When reading the book, it's hard not to find Billy Beane charming and compelling. You can see why Brad Pitt, who reportedly isn't even much of a baseball fan, wanted to play this guy in a movie. But something wrong about the book, or not really wrong, but a little misleading, is that the other GMs who were part of the Moneyball trend and the front office executives who would eventually follow in Billy Beane's footsteps, guys like Paul DePodesta, Andrew Friedman, Theo Epstein, Jeff Lunau, none of them would be nearly as interesting. Not that some of them weren't smart and good at their jobs, but the focus on a baseball lifer with a colorful personality like Billy Beane really masked the fact that what was happening in baseball wasn't all that different from what was happening in every industry in the country. A bunch of bean-counting consultants from Ivy League schools were figuring out ways to cut costs for owners, often at the expense of the product itself. And this is the final problem with Moneyball. Because the book is right that baseball in that era was at a turning point and on the cusp of a potential crisis. But it is very wrong in its diagnosis of what that crisis is. What Moneyball keeps saying in the book and the movie and in the overall legacy that people remember even now on Twitter is that the crisis in baseball is a competitive balance crisis. That low payroll, small market teams simply will not be able to compete with high payroll teams. But to be clear, there is no competitive balance crisis in baseball, and there never has been in the free agency era. Baseball has not had back-to-back World Series winners this century. Even though a smaller percentage of baseball teams make the playoffs than most other leagues, MLB has fewer teams with extended postseason droughts than any other North American sports league. The only team that hasn't made the postseason at least once in the last decade is the Angels, who are not even a small market team. Small market teams like the Royals, Guardians, and Rays have all made World Series runs in recent history, while other teams like the Brewers and Twins remain consistently competitive without huge payrolls. Because, as I mentioned, there is a simple way for low payroll teams to stay competitive, namely by having a lot of good young players who have not yet reached free agency. No, the real crisis in baseball had nothing to do with competitive balance. The real turning point that Moneyball captured had to do with owner backlash to the rise of free agency and the salary explosion of the late 1990s. Those years, prior to Moneyball, were the first years where players were finally getting a serious share of the revenue driven by the game. And Moneyball was a league-wide response by all the owners in every market to try and figure out how to stop that salary growth that came with free agency. And it was not just a matter of having a bunch of smart nerds crunch some new stats. Over time, they would gradually change the game itself in the name of saving owners money. Since young players under team control are so valuable, teams would tank for years on end to hoard draft picks for those young players. Since starting pitchers were so expensive on the open market, they would replace starters with a string of elite but anonymous and underpaid relief pitchers. Since defense was hard to measure and value, they would prioritize shifting and emphasize strikeouts at the expense of pitchers' health. These changes have often been very bad for the game, but they are all an extension of the logic of Moneyball. Because at its heart, Moneyball was really pro-owner propaganda. It was pretty good propaganda. The book was good, the movie was fun, and even all these years later, fans are editing the score into clips of real games. But Moneyball was insidious in that it got fans to identify with the owner's bottom line, to suddenly care whether a free agent signing was maximally efficient. It presented itself as being concerned with competitive balance, because that sounds a lot better than saying you're trying to help billionaires make more money. But that's really what the philosophy behind Moneyball was about. How do we slow the growth in player salaries and increase profitability for our worthless owners? And frankly, if you are a fan who wastes any time concerning yourself with whether your favorite team's owner is turning a profit, you're a sap. It's not just stupid for fans to care about this, it's actually bad for the game. Just this week, the organization behind Moneyball announced that it would no longer be known as the Oakland Athletics. For the next few seasons, they are just the Athletics, a team without a fan base or a community. Owners will steal your team in the night if it might make them a buck. So when they talk about new stats or recreating stars in the aggregate or rich teams versus poor teams, they're not being romantic about baseball. They're distracting you so they can rob you blind and destroy the game. That, sadly, is the real legacy of Moneyball.